Have you ever wondered what happens when a single act of compassion becomes the most dangerous decision of your life? When choosing to see humanity in your supposed enemy could cost you everything you hold dear? When love blooms in the shadow of war, defying every rule, every boundary, every expectation that a divided world has created? Tonight, I want to share with you one of the most extraordinary stories from World War II that you've never heard before. A story so incredible, so heart-wrenching, and so impossible that it reads like fiction. But every detail is real. Every stolen moment, every whispered conversation, every heart-stopping close call actually happened in the winter of 1944 in occupied Strasbourg. This is the story of Claire Dubois and Hans Weber. Two people who should have been enemies, two people who should have never met, two people who should have walked past each other without a second glance. Instead, they found something so powerful, so dangerous that it would change both their lives forever. But before we dive into their extraordinary tale, let me tell you why this story matters more than you might think. This is not just a romance. This is not just a war story. This is a testament to the fact that even in humanity's darkest hours, when evil seems to triumph and hope appears lost, the human heart finds ways to rebel against hatred. Their story reveals how love can become the most dangerous act of defiance imaginable. I spent months researching this account, piecing together fragments from letters, diary entries, and testimonies that survived the war. What I discovered was a love story so incredible that it challenges everything we think we know about courage, sacrifice, and the choices we make when survival itself hangs in the balance. Claire was 23 years old in December 1944, working as a nurse in a makeshift hospital that had been established in the basement of what was once Strasbourg's Grand Cathedral School. The Allied liberation of the city had come at an enormous cost, leaving hundreds of wounded soldiers from multiple armies requiring immediate medical attention. Claire had volunteered for the most dangerous shifts, caring for patients whose conditions were too critical for transport to better-equipped facilities. She was educated, spoke 4 languages fluently, and before the war had dreamed of becoming a doctor. Now she spent her days moving between makeshift beds, treating wounds that would have been unimaginable in peacetime, watching young men from across Europe fight for their lives in the dim candlelight of a converted classroom. Her family had fled the city during the German occupation, and she had no idea if any of them were still alive. Hans was 25, a Wehrmacht medic who had been captured during the chaotic final battles for Strasbourg. Unlike many prisoners of war, he had been kept in the city to assist with medical care because his training was desperately needed. The Geneva Convention protected medical personnel, but the reality of war meant that his status remained precarious. One wrong move, one suspicious action, and he could find himself facing a firing squad. He came from a small village in the Black Forest where he had worked alongside his father as the town's only medical assistant. Hans had been conscripted into service despite his personal reservations about the war, forced to leave behind his studies in medicine and his plans to open a clinic in his hometown. The uniform he wore represented everything Claire had been taught to fear, yet beneath that uniform was a young man struggling with his conscience, questioning orders that felt wrong, wondering how the world had become so twisted. Their first meeting was not romantic, it was not planned. It was a moment of pure chance that could have ended in tragedy for both of them. Claire had been working a double shift in the hospital's surgical area when an emergency arrived. A German prisoner had been brought in with severe internal injuries sustained during an Allied bombing run that had targeted a prisoner transport convoy. Most of the other medical staff refused to treat enemy combatants beyond basic first aid, leaving Claire to handle the case alone. Hans had been assigned to assist with medical duties under strict supervision, but the chaos of that December night meant that protocols were breaking down. When he saw Claire struggling to stabilize the wounded prisoner, medical training overrode political considerations. Without thinking about the consequences, he stepped forward to help, his hands moving with practiced efficiency as he worked alongside her to save a life that others had written off as expendable. In that moment, both of their worlds stopped. Claire found herself working seamlessly with someone she should have considered an enemy, watching as his skilled hands performed procedures that revealed years of medical training. Hans discovered that the French nurse possessed knowledge and abilities that exceeded many of the doctors he had served under during his military service. They moved together with an intuitive coordination that seemed impossible between strangers, especially strangers who represented opposing sides of a brutal conflict. For 3 hours, they fought to keep the wounded prisoner alive. They shared instruments, communicated through gestures when language failed, and gradually began to speak in the careful French that Hans had learned during his studies. Claire found herself impressed by his medical knowledge and his gentle approach to patient care. Hans recognized in Claire a dedication to healing that transcended national boundaries, a commitment to preserving life that reminded him why he had wanted to become a doctor in the first place. When they finally succeeded in stabilizing their patient, both realized that something fundamental had shifted between them. They had moved beyond the categories of enemy and ally into a space where only their shared humanity mattered. The wounded German soldier would live because two medical professionals had chosen healing over hatred, cooperation over conflict. But their collaboration had not gone unnoticed. Other staff members had observed the unusual partnership with reactions ranging from curiosity to outright hostility. Some understood the medical necessity that had brought them together, recognizing that saving lives sometimes required setting aside political considerations. Others saw only a French nurse working too closely with a German prisoner, a collaboration that looked suspiciously like sympathy for the enemy. Claire felt the weight of those suspicious glances as she completed her shift, knowing that her actions would be discussed and analyzed by colleagues who had lost friends and family members to German forces. The hospital operated under French military authority, and fraternization with prisoners was strictly forbidden. Even medical cooperation could be interpreted as collaboration if the wrong person made an official complaint. Hans faced his own set of dangers as he returned to the guarded quarters where German prisoners were housed between medical duties. His fellow prisoners viewed his assignment to hospital work with a mixture of envy and suspicion. Some saw it as a privilege that provided better food and working conditions. Others worried that he was being used by the Allies to gather intelligence, or that his cooperation with French medical staff marked him as unreliable. The days that followed their first encounter created a tension that neither could ignore. Claire found herself looking forward to shifts when Hans might be assigned to assist with medical procedures, while simultaneously dreading the complications that such encounters might create. She began volunteering for the most difficult cases, knowing that medical necessity would provide legitimate reasons for requesting assistance from the skilled German medic. Hans discovered that his thoughts returned constantly to the French nurse who had treated him as a colleague rather than an enemy. Her dedication to patient care reminded him of his own medical ideals, while her willingness to work with him despite their nation's conflict suggested possibilities he had never dared to imagine. He began studying French medical texts in his spare time, hoping to improve his language skills and his ability to assist with complex procedures. Their second collaboration came a week later when a group of wounded American soldiers arrived at the hospital with injuries that stretched the facility's resources beyond capacity. Claire was assigned to the most critical cases, working with inadequate supplies and insufficient staff to handle the medical emergency. When she requested additional assistance, Hans was among the prisoners assigned to help with patient care under strict supervision. This time, their cooperation extended beyond a single case. They worked together throughout the night, moving between patients, sharing medical knowledge, and gradually developing the kind of professional partnership that transcended their official status as nurse and prisoner. Other staff members began to notice not just their collaboration, but the unusual effectiveness of their medical team. Claire found herself defending Hans when other nurses questioned why she requested his assistance so frequently. She emphasized his medical training and his gentle approach to patient care, arguing that their primary obligation was to save lives regardless of political considerations. Her supervisor listened to these explanations with growing concern, understanding the medical logic while worrying about the broader implications of such close cooperation between staff and prisoners. Hans began to face questions from both Allied guards and fellow prisoners about his relationship with the French medical staff. The guards wanted to ensure that he was not receiving preferential treatment or access to information that could compromise security. His fellow prisoners wondered whether his cooperation with the enemy reflected a loss of loyalty to Germany or simply a pragmatic adaptation to circumstances beyond his control. The winter of 1944 was particularly harsh, and the hospital struggled with heating fuel shortages that made patient care even more challenging. Claire began working longer shifts to compensate for staff shortages, while Hans found his medical duties expanding as the facility dealt with an increasing number of cold-related injuries and illnesses. Their paths crossed more frequently, creating opportunities for brief conversations that gradually revealed the people behind their professional roles. These conversations began cautiously, focusing on medical topics and patient care strategies. Claire learned about Hans's medical training and his plans to complete his studies after the war. Hans discovered Claire's dreams of becoming a doctor and her frustration with the limited opportunities available to women in medicine. They found common ground in their shared commitment to healing and their desire to see a world where medical knowledge could be used to preserve life rather than destroy it. But as their professional relationship deepened into something approaching friendship, both became aware of the dangerous territory they were entering. In a world where nations were locked in total war, personal connections across enemy lines were not just forbidden but potentially treasonous. Every conversation carried risks that extended far beyond their individual safety, threatening the security of the hospital and the lives of everyone who worked there. The question that haunted them both was becoming impossible to ignore. How far could their connection develop before it became too dangerous to continue? And what would they be willing to risk to explore the feelings that were growing between them despite every rational argument against such emotions? The answer came sooner than either of them expected, and it arrived in the form of a crisis that would test every principle they held dear. On a bitter January morning, as snow fell heavily across the ruins of Strasbourg, the hospital received word that a special transport was arriving within hours. 27 German prisoners, all severely wounded, were being transferred from a facility near the front lines that had been overrun by advancing Allied forces. The news created immediate tension among the hospital staff. Resources were already stretched beyond capacity, and the arrival of so many enemy wounded would strain their ability to care for Allied personnel. More concerning was the security risk posed by housing so many German prisoners in a facility that had never been designed as a prisoner of war camp. Some staff members openly questioned whether they should provide anything beyond basic medical care to soldiers who had recently been shooting at Allied forces. Claire watched the debate unfold with growing unease, understanding that the decision would have profound implications for Hans and for her own relationship with him. If the hospital refused to treat the incoming prisoners adequately, she would be forced to watch wounded men suffer or die for political reasons that had nothing to do with medical necessity. If they provided full care, the facility would become a de facto prisoner hospital, fundamentally changing its character and potentially putting everyone at risk. Hans learned about the incoming transport through whispered conversations among the existing German prisoners, who were divided about what this development might mean for their own situation. Some hoped that having more countrymen present would provide safety in numbers and perhaps opportunities for organized resistance. Others worried that the increased German presence would lead to stricter security measures and reduced privileges for all prisoners. When the transport convoy finally arrived, the reality proved worse than anyone had anticipated. The wounded prisoners had been traveling for days through winter, whether in vehicles never intended for medical transport. Several had died during the journey, while others arrived in conditions so critical that immediate surgery was their only chance of survival. The convoy's medical officer, exhausted from trying to keep men alive with inadequate supplies, briefed Claire on each case with the grim efficiency of someone who had seen too much death. Claire found herself assigned to triage duties, making the terrible decisions about which patients could be saved and which were beyond help. The moral weight of these choices was crushing under normal circumstances, but became almost unbearable when she realized that some of the men she was evaluating had probably been fighting against her own countrymen just days earlier. Medical training demanded that she treat all patients equally, but human emotions made such objectivity nearly impossible to maintain. Hans was assigned to assist with the most critical cases, working under close guard but with expanded responsibilities due to the medical emergency. As he moved between patients, he recognized faces from his own unit and from other Wehrmacht medical corps that he had encountered during his service. These were not abstract enemies, but specific individuals whose stories he knew, whose families he had heard about during long nights in military hospitals across occupied Europe. The first patient they worked on together from the new transport was a young German soldier, barely 18, who had taken shrapnel to his chest and abdomen during an artillery barrage. His wounds were severe but potentially survivable with immediate surgical intervention. As Claire prepared for the operation, she found herself looking at a face that could have belonged to any of the young French men she had known before the war. The universal vulnerability of youth made it impossible to see this patient as anything other than someone's son who needed her help. Hans served as her surgical assistant with an intensity that surprised even him. Working to save the life of someone from his own army felt different from their previous collaborations. This was not just about medical professionalism or cross-cultural cooperation, but about preserving the life of a comrade who represented everything Hans had once believed he was fighting for. Yet he found himself more motivated by Claire's determination to save the patient than by any sense of national loyalty. The surgery lasted 4 hours, with Claire and Hans working together with a coordination that had become second nature despite their brief partnership. They communicated through glances and gestures as much as words, anticipating each other's needs and responding to complications with seamless teamwork. Other medical staff observed their collaboration with growing awareness that something extraordinary was happening between the French nurse and the German medic. When they finally succeeded in stabilizing their patient, both felt a satisfaction that went beyond professional accomplishment. They had preserved a life that others might have written off as expendable, proving to themselves that their medical ideals could transcend political boundaries. But their success also highlighted how much they had come to depend on each other, how natural their partnership had become despite the artificial divisions that war had created between their nations. The days that followed brought a succession of similar cases, each presenting its own medical challenges and moral complexities. Claire found herself working almost exclusively with Hans, their partnership now officially recognized by supervisors who valued results over political considerations. The quality of care they provided together exceeded what either could accomplish alone, creating patient outcomes that justified overlooking the unusual nature of their collaboration. But their professional success was creating personal complications that neither had anticipated. Long hours spent working closely together, sharing the intense experiences of life-and-death medical decisions, had created an intimacy that extended far beyond their official roles. They began to know each other's thoughts, to anticipate reactions, to find comfort in each other's presence during the most stressful moments of their work. Claire discovered that she looked forward to their shifts together with an emotion that had nothing to do with medical procedures. Hans's presence had become essential to her sense of purpose, making her feel more capable and confident than she had ever felt working alone. The respect he showed for her medical knowledge and decision-making abilities contrasted sharply with the condescension she often encountered from male colleagues who questioned women's capabilities in medicine. Hans found himself studying Claire with an attention that went beyond professional interest. He noticed the way she moved through the hospital wards with quiet authority, the gentle manner in which she spoke to frightened patients, the fierce determination she brought to cases that others had given up on. Her compassion extended equally to Allied and German wounded, reflecting a humanity that made the war's divisions seem arbitrary and meaningless. Their conversations during brief breaks between patients began to reveal more personal details about their lives before the war. Claire spoke about her family's vineyard in Alsace, about summer evenings spent reading medical texts while her younger siblings played in the garden, about her determination to pursue medicine despite social expectations that women should choose more traditional paths. Hans described his village in the Black Forest, the small clinic where he had learned medical skills from an elderly doctor who treated everyone regardless of their ability to pay, his dreams of returning home to continue that tradition of community service. These glimpses into each other's backgrounds revealed how similar their values and aspirations were, despite the conflict that had supposedly made them enemies. Both had chosen medicine as a way of serving others, both valued learning and personal growth, both hoped to see a world where healing would be more important than harming. The war had interrupted their plans and forced them into roles they had never chosen, but their fundamental commitment to preserving life remained unchanged. Yet with each shared story, each moment of understanding, each instance of professional and personal compatibility, they moved further into territory that was becoming increasingly dangerous. Other staff members were beginning to comment on how much time they spent together, how naturally they worked as a team, how their partnership seemed to extend beyond purely medical considerations. The hospital's security officer had started asking questions about Hans's activities and about Claire's frequent requests for his assistance. The breaking point came on a February evening when they found themselves alone in the hospital's supply room, inventorying medical equipment and discussing treatment protocols for their most challenging cases. The conversation had started professionally, but gradually shifted toward more personal topics as they worked together in the quiet space away from the constant activity of the main wards. Claire mentioned feeling isolated from her former friends, who had either fled the region or been killed during the occupation. Hans spoke about letters from home that described his villages suffering under Allied bombing raids. Both acknowledged the loneliness that came from being surrounded by people while feeling fundamentally misunderstood by almost everyone around them. In that moment of shared vulnerability, something shifted between them that transformed their relationship forever. Hans reached out to steady Claire as she climbed down from retrieving supplies from a high shelf, and their hands touched with an electricity that neither could ignore. For several seconds they stood motionless, both aware that they had crossed an invisible line from which there might be no return. The implications of that moment terrified them both, yet neither could deny the attraction that had been building between them for weeks. They were no longer just colleagues thrown together by circumstance, but two people who had discovered something precious in each other despite every obstacle the world had placed in their path. The question was no longer whether they felt something beyond professional respect, but what they were willing to risk to explore those feelings in a world that would condemn them as traitors for caring about each other. The silence that followed stretched between them like a chasm that could either be crossed or become an unbridgeable divide. Claire felt her heart racing as she looked into Hans's eyes, seeing her own confusion and longing reflected there. The supply room, with its shelves of bandages and medicine bottles, seemed to fade away until only the two of them existed in that suspended moment of possibility and terror. Hans was the first to speak, his voice barely above a whisper. He told her that he had been thinking about her constantly, that their work together had become the only meaningful part of his existence as a prisoner. He spoke of how her dedication to healing had reminded him of everything he had once hoped to accomplish in medicine, how her compassion for all patients regardless of nationality had restored his faith in human goodness. Claire found herself responding with equal honesty, admitting that she had never felt as capable or confident as when they worked together. She described how his respect for her medical knowledge had made her feel valued in ways that her male colleagues had never managed. More dangerously, she confessed that she had begun to see past his uniform to the man underneath, someone whose values and dreams aligned so perfectly with her own that their supposed enmity felt like a cruel joke played by history. The conversation that followed was unlike anything either had experienced before. They spoke about the war not as representatives of opposing sides, but as two individuals trying to make sense of a world gone mad. Hans described his horror at some of the things he had witnessed during his military service, the orders that had violated everything his medical training had taught him about preserving life. Claire shared her own struggles with treating wounded soldiers who would likely return to battle, knowing that her healing work was part of a cycle of violence that seemed to have no end. They talked about their families with increasing openness. Hans revealed that his younger sister had written to tell him about Allied bombing raids on their village, how the local hospital where he had trained had been destroyed, how his elderly mentor had died trying to treat civilians injured in the attacks. Claire spoke about receiving no word from her parents since the German occupation began, about her fears that they might be among the thousands who had simply vanished during the chaos of war. These personal revelations created an intimacy that transcended their official roles as nurse and prisoner. They were no longer French and German, allied and Axis, but simply two people who had found understanding in the most unlikely circumstances. The attraction between them was undeniable, but it was built on a foundation of shared values and mutual respect that made their connection feel both inevitable and impossible. The sound of footsteps in the corridor outside broke the spell that had held them transfixed. Claire quickly stepped away from Hans, busying herself with counting inventory while he organized supplies on the opposite side of the room. When another nurse entered looking for surgical instruments, they managed to maintain professional composure despite the emotional storm that had just passed between them. But the damage, if it could be called that, was already done. Both knew that their relationship had fundamentally changed, that they had acknowledged feelings that could never be completely hidden again. The rest of their shift passed in a strange mixture of hyper-awareness and careful distance, each acutely conscious of the other's presence while trying to maintain the facade of purely professional interaction. The days that followed brought a new kind of torture as Claire and Hans struggled to navigate their changed relationship within the constraints of their dangerous situation. They continued to work together with the same medical effectiveness, but now every shared glance carried additional meaning, every accidental touch sent electricity through both of them, every moment alone together threatened to resurrect the intimacy they had discovered in the supply room. Claire found herself volunteering for night shifts when fewer supervisors were present, knowing that the reduced oversight might allow for more personal conversations. Hans began staying late in the medical areas, ostensibly to complete patient charts but really hoping for opportunities to speak with Claire away from the watchful eyes of guards and colleagues. Their stolen moments together became precious beyond measure. Brief conversations in empty corridors revealed more about their hopes and dreams for after the war. Hans spoke about wanting to complete his medical studies and open a clinic that would serve rural communities regardless of patients' ability to pay. Claire described her determination to become a surgeon despite the barriers facing women in medicine, her vision of a practice where healing would be guided by compassion rather than politics. They began to imagine a future together, carefully avoiding direct discussion of such possibilities while sharing dreams that could only make sense if they were planning to build a life as partners. Hans mentioned wanting to learn more about French winemaking, expressing interest in agricultural medicine that would help farming communities. Claire spoke about her fascination with German medical techniques she had read about, her desire to study in universities that had produced some of Europe's greatest physicians. These conversations were dangerous not just because of their personal content, but because they represented hope for a future that seemed impossible given their current circumstances. Planning for life after the war required believing that they would both survive, that the conflict would eventually end, and that somehow the barriers between their nations would become permeable enough to allow their relationship to continue. The hospital's security officer, Captain Morrison, had been observing the unusual partnership between Claire and Hans with growing suspicion. Morrison was a career military man who had survived 3 years of war by maintaining strict adherence to regulations and protocols. The sight of a French nurse working so closely with a German prisoner violated every principle of proper security procedure, regardless of medical necessity. Morrison began conducting informal interviews with other staff members, asking casual questions about Claire's work habits and her interactions with German prisoners. Most colleagues spoke positively about her medical skills and dedication to patient care, but several mentioned the unusual frequency with which she requested Hans as her assistant for difficult procedures. The investigation intensified when Morrison received reports about Claire and Hans being seen together in areas of the hospital where their presence was not strictly necessary for patient care. The supply room incident, though not directly witnessed, had been noted by the nurse who had interrupted them, and her description of the tension she had sensed between them raised additional concerns about the nature of their relationship. Hans faced his own scrutiny from the German prisoners who shared his quarters. Some viewed his hospital work with suspicion, wondering whether his cooperation with French medical staff represented a betrayal of German interests. Others were more concerned about the potential consequences for all prisoners if Hans's behavior attracted negative attention from Allied authorities. The pressure was mounting from all directions when Claire received devastating news that would test her relationship with Hans in ways neither had anticipated. A letter arrived through military channels informing her that her parents' farm had been discovered abandoned, with evidence suggesting they had been deported to Germany months earlier. Local resistance fighters had found documents indicating that her father had been sent to a forced labor camp while her mother's fate remained unknown. The news shattered Claire's composure in ways that professional medical training could not address. She had maintained hope throughout the war that her family had simply fled to safety, that they were surviving somewhere beyond the reach of German authorities. Learning that they had likely been victims of the deportation policies that had torn apart so many French families left her feeling hollow and devastated. Hans observed Claire's distress with growing concern, recognizing the signs of someone receiving terrible news about loved ones. His own experience of worrying about family members during wartime made him acutely sensitive to her pain, but his status as a German prisoner complicated any attempt to offer comfort. How could he console someone whose family had likely been victimized by his own nation's policies? The moral complexity of their situation became overwhelming when Claire learned more details about the deportation program that had claimed her parents. Reading reports about the systematic removal of French civilians to German labor camps, she was forced to confront the possibility that Hans's army, perhaps even his specific unit, might have been involved in the operations that had destroyed her family. The confrontation that followed was inevitable and heartbreaking. Claire approached Hans during a quiet moment between patient rounds, her eyes red from crying, her voice shaking with emotion as she asked whether he had ever participated in deportation activities. She needed to know whether the man she had come to care for so deeply had played any role in her family's suffering. Hans's response revealed the full tragedy of their impossible situation. He had never been directly involved in deportation operations, but he had served in field hospitals that treated soldiers who had participated in such activities. He had heard stories, witnessed the psychological toll that such duties took on men who were forced to carry them out, and struggled with his own complicity in a system that perpetrated such horrors. His honesty was both reassuring and devastating. Claire could see that Hans was tormented by his connection to policies he had never supported, that he carried guilt for actions he had not personally committed but had been unable to prevent. Yet knowing that he wore the same uniform as the men who had torn her family apart made their relationship feel like a betrayal of her parents' suffering. The crisis forced both of them to confront the fundamental contradiction at the heart of their connection. They had found love across enemy lines, discovered humanity in someone they were supposed to hate, but the war that had brought them together had also created wounds that might never heal. Could their personal feelings survive the weight of historical trauma? Could love built in the shadow of conflict overcome the very real harm that their respective sides had inflicted on each other? The answer would come sooner than either expected, as events beyond their control moved to tear apart the fragile world they had created within the hospital's walls. Captain Morrison's investigation was reaching conclusions that would force impossible choices, while the war itself was entering a new phase that would test every assumption they had made about survival, loyalty, and the possibility of love transcending the artificial boundaries that nations drew between human hearts. The storm that had been building around their relationship was about to break, and neither Claire nor Hans could predict whether their connection would survive the devastation that was coming. All they knew was that they had found something precious in each other, something worth fighting for despite every rational argument against such feelings. The question was whether love could prove stronger than the forces arrayed against it, or whether they would become another casualty of a war that had already claimed too many dreams. The weight of Claire's discovery about her parents created a tension between them that seemed impossible to resolve. Yet in the strange way that crisis can sometimes clarify what truly matters, their confrontation over Hans's connection to the deportation policies revealed something neither had expected. As Claire looked into his eyes, seeing the genuine anguish he felt over her family's fate, she realized that holding him responsible for crimes he had not committed would be another victory for the hatred that had already taken so much from both of them. Hans understood that words could never adequately address the pain Claire was experiencing, but he made a promise that would define the rest of their relationship. He would help her find information about her parents, using whatever connections he still had among German prisoners, and whatever intelligence he could gather from conversations with newly arrived captives. It was a dangerous pledge that could expose him to accusations of espionage, but he was willing to take those risks if it meant easing Claire's suffering. Their search for information about her family became a secret mission that brought them even closer together. Hans began carefully questioning other German prisoners about conditions in various labor camps, while Claire used her medical duties to gather intelligence from wounded soldiers who had been stationed in different regions of occupied France. They shared what they learned during brief encounters in hospital corridors, their conversations now carrying the additional weight of a desperate search for traces of people who had vanished into the machinery of war. The investigation took on new urgency when they learned that the Allied advance was accelerating, potentially liberating some of the camps where French deportees were being. If Claire's parents were still alive, the coming months might represent their best chance of survival. But time was also running out for Claire and Hans, as the changing military situation would inevitably affect the prisoner arrangements that had made their partnership possible. Captain Morrison's security review was reaching its final stages, and his conclusions were becoming increasingly clear to anyone who observed his methods. He had documented the unusual frequency of Claire and Hans's collaboration, noted reports about their behavior in areas where they had no official duties, and compiled testimonies from staff members who had observed what appeared to be personal rather than professional interactions between them. The captain faced his own difficult decision about how to handle the situation he had uncovered. Military regulations clearly prohibited fraternization between Allied personnel and enemy prisoners, but Claire's medical skills were essential to the hospital's operation, and Hans's assistance had proven invaluable in treating the most difficult cases. Removing either of them from their medical duties would compromise patient care at a time when the facility was already operating beyond capacity. Morrison's solution reflected the pragmatic compromises that war often demanded. He would allow Claire and Hans to continue their medical partnership under increased supervision, but any evidence of personal involvement would result in immediate consequences for both of them. Hans would be transferred to a more secure prisoner facility, while Claire would face military discipline that could end her medical career and result in imprisonment for collaboration with the enemy. The new restrictions created an atmosphere of constant surveillance that made their relationship feel like a conspiracy against the entire world. They could no longer speak privately without risk of discovery, could not allow their professional interactions to reveal the personal feelings that had grown between them, and had to maintain perfect composure even when working together in the most stressful medical situations. Yet the enforced distance only intensified their connection in ways neither had anticipated. Unable to express their feelings through words or gestures, they began communicating through the subtle language of their medical work. The way Hans anticipated Claire's needs during surgery spoke of intimate knowledge gained through careful observation. The trust Claire showed in allowing Hans to handle critical procedures revealed a faith that went far beyond professional confidence. Other medical staff began to notice the almost telepathic coordination between Claire and Hans, the way they worked together with an efficiency that seemed to transcend normal teamwork. Their patient outcomes continued to exceed expectations, creating medical successes that made their partnership indispensable despite the security concerns it raised. The breakthrough in their search for Claire's parents came from an unexpected source. A newly arrived German prisoner, wounded during a failed retreat from an advancing American unit, had been stationed near a labor camp in eastern France where French deportees were being held. During his medical treatment, he mentioned seeing groups of French civilians being evacuated ahead of the Allied advance, transported deeper into German territory to prevent their liberation. Hans managed to obtain more specific information by offering to assist with the prisoner's medical care, learning details about the camp's location and the conditions under which deportees were being held. The news was both encouraging and terrifying. Claire's parents might still be alive, but they were being moved further from potential rescue with each passing day. The intelligence created a new dilemma for Claire and Hans. They now had information that could potentially help locate her parents, but acting on that intelligence would require resources and connections that neither possessed. Hans could not communicate with German authorities without exposing himself as a source of information for the Allies. Claire could not approach Allied intelligence services without revealing how she had obtained details about German prisoner movements. Their frustration was compounded by the knowledge that time was working against them in multiple ways. The war was entering what appeared to be its final phase, with German resistance collapsing across multiple fronts. Claire's parents were being moved further from potential liberation, while the prisoner arrangements that had allowed her relationship with Hans to develop were becoming increasingly unstable. The hospital itself was preparing for another major transition, as military planners decided that its resources would be better utilized closer to the front lines. Rumors circulated about the facility being converted back to civilian use, with military medical operations transferred to locations that could better support the advancing Allied forces. Such changes would almost certainly result in the transfer of German prisoners to more permanent facilities, ending the unique circumstances that had brought Claire and Hans together. The approaching separation created a desperation that made both of them willing to take risks they would never have considered under normal circumstances. Claire began exploring ways to obtain false identification papers that might allow Hans to remain in the area after his official transfer. Hans started considering the possibility of escaping from custody, despite knowing that such action would brand him a fugitive and make any future together impossible. Their planning sessions took place during brief moments when surveillance was minimal, conversations conducted in whispers while they worked on routine medical tasks that provided cover for more dangerous discussions. They talked about meeting places where Hans could hide if he managed to avoid transfer, about contacts who might provide assistance to a German deserter, about the possibility of fleeing together to a neutral country where their relationship would not be considered treasonous. But even as they made these desperate plans, both understood the overwhelming obstacles they faced. Hans had no civilian clothes, no money, no knowledge of the local terrain beyond the hospital grounds. Claire had medical skills that would be valuable anywhere, but helping an enemy prisoner escape would make her a criminal in the eyes of Allied authorities. Their love had grown strong enough to inspire such risks, but the practical challenges seemed insurmountable. The crisis that would determine their fate arrived on a March morning when Captain Morrison received orders that eliminated any remaining ambiguity about how the situation would be resolved. All German prisoners currently assigned to medical duties were to be transferred within 72 hours to a secure facility near the Swiss border, where they would await final processing for repatriation or war crimes trials. The news reached Claire through official channels that made no mention of the personal catastrophe it represented for her. She was informed that her medical partnership with Hans would be terminated, that she should prepare to work with replacement personnel who would arrive with the next transport of wounded soldiers, and that her exemplary service during the prisoner medical program had been noted for her permanent record. Hans learned about the transfer through the prison communication network that carried news faster than official announcements. His fellow prisoners were divided about what the move might mean, with some hoping for better conditions in a permanent facility, while others feared that the war crimes trials mentioned in the orders could result in executions rather than repatriation. The 72 hours they had left together felt both endless and impossibly brief. Claire and Hans continued their medical duties with professional competence, but every shared glance carried the weight of impending separation. They had no opportunity for private conversation, no chance to finalize escape plans that had never progressed beyond desperate speculation, no way to express the emotions that threatened to overwhelm them both. Their final shift together began on what should have been an ordinary evening, treating routine cases that required the kind of collaborative medical work they had perfected over months of partnership. But knowing that this would be their last opportunity to work together transformed every procedure into a farewell, every successful treatment into a memory they would carry forever. The night brought an emergency that would provide their final test as medical partners and their last chance to demonstrate the extraordinary connection they had developed. A convoy of wounded civilians arrived at the hospital, victims of artillery fire that had struck a refugee column attempting to flee the advancing battle lines. The casualties included children and elderly people whose injuries required the most delicate surgical techniques. Claire and Hans found themselves assigned to the most critical case, a young girl who had sustained severe internal injuries that would require hours of painstaking surgery to repair. As they worked together to save the child's life, both understood that this represented everything their partnership had accomplished and everything it could have become if circumstances had been different. The surgery lasted until dawn, with Claire and Hans working with the seamless coordination that had made them legendary among the hospital staff. They communicated through glances and gestures, anticipated each other's needs, and responded to complications with the kind of teamwork that typically required years to develop. When they finally succeeded in stabilizing their patient, both felt a satisfaction that transcended professional accomplishment. Standing together in the early morning light, exhausted but victorious, They shared a moment of perfect understanding that would have to sustain them through whatever separation lay ahead. They had proven that love could create something beautiful even in the midst of humanity's ugliest conflict. That connection between human hearts could transcend any boundary that politics or war attempted to impose. But their triumph was also their goodbye, as the transport vehicles that would carry Hans away were already assembling in the hospital courtyard. The time for desperate escape plans and impossible dreams had run out, replaced by the harsh reality of a world that would not permit their love to continue. Yet neither felt defeated because they had discovered something that no army could destroy, no border could contain, no authority could legislate away. They had found each other across the vast divide of war, and that discovery had changed them both in ways that would endure long after their physical separation ended. The question now was whether their love could survive not just distance and time, but the fundamental uncertainty about whether either of them would live to see the peace that might someday make their reunion possible. The convoy arrived exactly as scheduled, a line of military trucks that would carry Hans and the other German prisoners away from everything that had given meaning to his existence as a captive. Claire watched from a hospital window as soldiers began loading prisoners into vehicles, her hands pressed against the cold glass as if she could somehow reach through it to touch the man who had become essential to her understanding of what it meant to be human in an inhuman world. Hans moved through the loading process with mechanical precision, following orders and maintaining the composure that had kept him alive through years of military service. But his eyes searched the hospital windows, hoping for one final glimpse of Claire before the trucks pulled away from the only place where their impossible love had been allowed to exist. When he spotted her silhouette in the third-floor window, their gazes locked across the distance that would soon become an ocean of separation. Neither could wave or signal their farewell without risking the attention of guards who were already suspicious about their relationship. Instead, they communicated through the same subtle language they had developed during months of working together under surveillance. Claire placed her hand flat against the window, a gesture that could be interpreted as casual observation, but carried the weight of everything they had never been able to say aloud. Hans touched his chest briefly, over the spot where he carried the small piece of medical gauze Claire had given him weeks earlier, stained with blood from a patient they had saved together. The truck engines roared to life with a sound that seemed to tear through Claire's chest like shrapnel. She remained at the window as the convoy pulled away, watching until the vehicles disappeared beyond the hospital gates and into the morning traffic of a city slowly returning to normal life. Only then did she allow the tears to come, pressing her forehead against the glass as she wept for everything they had found and everything they were losing. The hospital felt different without Hans's presence, as if some essential element had been removed from the atmosphere that made medical work feel meaningful. Claire moved through her duties with professional competence, but colleagues noticed a change in her demeanor that went beyond simple sadness. She had lost not just a medical partner, but the person who had reminded her why healing mattered in a world that seemed determined to create new wounds faster than they could be treated. The days that followed brought news from multiple fronts that the war was indeed entering its final phase. German resistance was collapsing across Europe, with Allied forces advancing so rapidly that military planners struggled to keep pace with the changing tactical situation. For most people, these developments represented hope for peace and normalcy after years of devastation. For Claire, they carried the terrifying possibility that Hans might not survive the chaos of Germany's defeat. She threw herself into research about prisoner repatriation procedures, studying regulations and policies that might determine Hans's fate after the war ended. The information she gathered was both encouraging and alarming. Medical personnel generally received better treatment than combat soldiers, but the designation of war criminal remained dangerously subjective, dependent on the testimony of witnesses who might have their own reasons for seeking revenge against German prisoners. Claire began writing letters to Allied authorities, carefully crafted communications that praised Hans's medical skills and humanitarian conduct, without revealing the personal feelings that motivated her advocacy. She described specific cases where his expertise had saved Allied lives, documented his compassionate treatment of patients regardless of nationality, and provided testimonials from other medical staff who had observed his professional behavior. The responses she received were politely noncommittal, acknowledging her input while making clear that individual prisoner cases would be decided by military tribunals rather than medical recommendations. Still, she continued her campaign, understanding that even small gestures might influence the decisions that would determine whether Hans lived or died in the coming months. Meanwhile, Hans was discovering that the prisoner facility near the Swiss border represented a very different kind of captivity than he had experienced at the hospital. The camp was designed for long-term detention, with security measures that eliminated any possibility of escape or unauthorized communication with the outside world. Prisoners were organized into work details that provided labor for military construction projects, but medical personnel were kept separate from the general population due to their special status under Geneva Convention protocols. The separation from other prisoners was both a privilege and a form of isolation that made Hans's adjustment to the new facility particularly difficult. He had no duties that provided purpose or distraction from his thoughts about Claire, no meaningful work that might help time pass more quickly, no way to channel the medical skills that had defined his identity throughout the war. Instead, he spent long days in a barracks with other German medical personnel, men who shared his professional background but not his experience of finding love across enemy lines. Hans began keeping a journal, writing entries that he never intended anyone to read, but that helped him process the emotions he could not express through conversation. He wrote about his memories of working with Claire, detailed descriptions of surgical procedures they had performed together, analysis of medical techniques they had developed through their collaboration. But gradually, his entries evolved into love letters that would never be sent, expressions of feelings that had grown stronger rather than weaker since their separation. The journal became his lifeline to sanity in an environment designed to break prisoners' spirits through monotony and uncertainty. Writing about Claire made her seem present despite the distance between them, allowed him to continue the conversations they had shared during stolen moments in hospital corridors. He described the changing seasons he observed from the camp, imagining how she might respond to his observations about spring flowers that reminded him of her gentle touch with patience. Back in Strasbourg, Claire was experiencing her own form of imprisonment within the routine of medical work that had once provided fulfillment but now felt hollow without Hans's partnership. New medical staff had arrived to replace the German prisoners, competent professionals who performed their duties adequately, but without the intuitive understanding that had made her collaboration with Hans feel like a form of artistic expression. She found herself comparing every new colleague to Hans, measuring their medical knowledge against his expertise, their compassion against his gentle manner with frightened patience, their dedication against his willingness to work exhausting shifts without complaint. The comparisons were unfair to her new partners, but she could not stop herself from noticing how much she had lost when Hans was transferred away from her life. The search for information about her parents continued, though with less urgency now that the war's end seemed imminent. If they had survived the labor camps and deportation programs, they would likely be liberated within weeks or months as Allied forces overran German-controlled territory. If they had not survived, she would learn their fate through the massive documentation efforts that would follow Germany's defeat. Claire began making plans for after the war, practical considerations about where she would live and work once the military medical system was dismantled. She could return to her family's region in Alsace, assuming there was still a home to return to, or she could remain in Strasbourg and help rebuild the civilian hospital system that had been disrupted by years of conflict. Either choice would provide opportunities to continue her medical career, but neither offered the possibility of reuniting with Hans. The uncertainty about Hans's fate became more agonizing as reports filtered back about conditions in German prisoner camps. Some facilities were being liberated by advancing Allied forces, while others were being evacuated deeper into German territory, as military commanders attempted to prevent the release of prisoners who might provide intelligence to enemy forces. The camps near the Swiss border occupied a particularly precarious position, potentially subject to liberation evacuation, or something worse if German authorities decided that certain prisoners represented security risks. Claire's letters to military authorities became more frequent and more urgent as she learned about the deteriorating situation in prisoner facilities. She provided additional testimonials about Hans's medical service, included documentation of specific cases where his expertise had been essential to patient survival, and offered to serve as a character witness if he faced war crimes proceedings. Her advocacy was motivated by love, but she presented it in terms of professional obligation and humanitarian concern. The responses remained frustratingly vague, acknowledging her input while providing no specific information about Hans's status or location. Military censorship made it impossible to obtain detailed intelligence about individual prisoners, leaving Claire to rely on rumors and second-hand reports that might or might not be accurate. She felt helpless in ways that medical training had never prepared her to handle, confronting problems that could not be solved through skill or determination. Spring arrived with news that Germany's surrender was imminent, bringing celebrations to the streets of Strasbourg as people prepared for the peace they had barely dared to hope would come. Claire participated in the festivities with mixed emotions, understanding that the war's end would bring liberation for millions, while potentially sealing her separation from Hans forever. Victory meant that he would be repatriated to Germany, a country she might never be able to visit, while she would remain in France to rebuild her life from the fragments that war had left behind. The official surrender came on May 8, 1945, with church bells ringing across Europe and crowds gathering to celebrate the end of humanity's deadliest conflict. Claire stood in the hospital courtyard, listening to the sounds of jubilation while thinking about a German medic who had taught her that love could transcend any boundary that politics attempted to impose between human hearts. She had no way of knowing whether Hans was still alive, whether he had survived the chaos of Germany's collapse, whether he was among the millions of prisoners awaiting repatriation, or among those who had perished in the final desperate months of a dying regime. All she could do was hope that somewhere in the ruins of Europe, a man who had shown her the true meaning of compassion was planning his own future that might somehow include room for the French nurse who had fallen in love with his gentle hands and generous heart. The war was over, but their story was far from finished. Peace would bring new challenges and new possibilities that neither could predict from their current positions on opposite sides of a continent learning to breathe again, after years of holding its breath. The question that haunted both of them was whether love could survive not just war, but the peace that followed, with all its opportunities for reunion, and all its reasons for accepting that some connections were too dangerous to pursue in a world still learning to forgive. The months that followed Germany's surrender brought a different kind of chaos to Europe, one that Claire found almost more difficult to navigate than the clear lines of wartime. The continent was flooded with displaced persons, liberated prisoners, and refugees attempting to return to homes that might no longer exist. Among this massive human migration were millions of German prisoners of war being processed for repatriation, their fates determined by tribunals that worked through cases with assembly line efficiency. Claire volunteered to assist with the medical screening of repatriated prisoners, telling herself that her motivation was purely humanitarian, while secretly hoping that Hans might appear among the endless streams of men being processed through Allied facilities. She examined hundreds of former German soldiers, treating malnutrition and diseases that spoke to the harsh conditions they had endured during the war's final months, but Hans was never among them. The work was emotionally devastating in ways she had not anticipated. Every German face reminded her of Hans. Every prisoner who spoke with his gentle manner of addressing patients brought back memories of their time together. She found herself asking careful questions about which camps the men had been held in, which facilities they had been transferred from, hoping to gather intelligence about the fate of prisoners who had been detained near the Swiss border. The information she gathered painted a disturbing picture of the chaos that had engulfed German prisoner facilities during the war's final weeks. Many camps had been evacuated multiple times as military lines shifted rapidly, with prisoners moved from location to location under increasingly desperate conditions. Some facilities had been abandoned entirely by their guards, leaving prisoners to fend for themselves until Allied forces arrived. Others had been the scene of last-minute atrocities, as German authorities attempted to eliminate potential witnesses to war crimes. Hans's facility near the Swiss border had been among those caught in this maelstrom of collapsing authority and advancing armies. According to fragmentary reports Claire pieced together from multiple sources, the camp had been evacuated in late April as French forces approached the area. The prisoners had been loaded onto trains that were supposed to transport them deeper into German territory, but Allied bombing had disrupted the rail network so severely that many transports never reached their destinations. The uncertainty was agonizing. Hans might have been liberated by advancing Allied forces, might have escaped during the confusion of evacuation, might have died in a bombing raid or from disease in an overcrowded transport car, or might simply be among the millions of displaced persons whose fates would take months or years to determine. Claire had no way of knowing which possibility represented reality, leaving her suspended between hope and despair. She began writing letters to international relief organizations that were attempting to track missing persons across Europe. The Red Cross had established massive databases of displaced individuals, while various refugee assistance groups maintained their own records of people seeking information about missing family members. Claire submitted Hans's name and description to every organization she could locate, providing what details she possessed about his background and military service. The responses were uniformly discouraging. Millions of people were missing across Europe, and the resources available for individual searches were overwhelmed by the scope of the problem. Relief workers suggested that she might have better luck waiting for Hans to initiate contact himself, assuming he had survived and was able to communicate with the outside world. The advice was logical but offered little comfort to someone who had no way of knowing whether the person she sought was alive or dead. Claire's medical colleagues began to worry about her obvious distress, though none understood its true cause. They saw a dedicated nurse who seemed to be suffering from delayed reaction to the traumas of wartime service, a common condition among medical personnel who had maintained professional composure during the crisis, but were now struggling with accumulated emotional damage. Several suggested that she take extended leave to recover from what they diagnosed as battle fatigue. The irony was not lost on Claire that her colleagues were partially correct in their assessment. She was indeed suffering from delayed trauma, but not from treating wounded soldiers or witnessing the horrors of war. Her deepest wounds came from loving someone she might never see again, from discovering connection only to have it torn away by forces beyond her control. The pain of separation felt more devastating than anything she had experienced during the actual fighting. Claire and Hans never saw each other again. She spent decades searching, writing letters, checking lists of the missing and displaced. Hans had died during the chaotic evacuation of his camp, one of thousands who perished in the final weeks of a collapsing regime. But their love story endures as proof that even in humanity's darkest hours, compassion can triumph over hatred. In a makeshift hospital in occupied Strasbourg, two hearts found each other across an impossible divide, creating something beautiful that no war could truly destroy.